Steve. Now, as you well know, the Conservative Party is finished as the party of government for now. But here to discuss this is the former Conservative minister and member of Parliament for High Wycombe, wasn't it, for 14 years, Steve Baker. Good evening, Steve.
Good evening, Darren. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you for coming in. Now, Steve, I'm wondering, do you feel like the Conservative Party has let people down? Because that's what we hear from GBNews viewers so very often, that they feel personally quite betrayed. Would you use that language?
I try to avoid the word betrayed. I think that'd be going too far. But plainly, they feel let down. In Wycombe, about half my voters didn't turn out. I had 26,000 votes at the last election, and only 11,000 people voted Conservative. Now, I lost part of my constituency, but even allowing for that, 10 to 12,000 people just stayed at home. And, you know, it wasn't Reform's fault. Reform did quite well, but those voters stayed at home, and that's a big deal. And I don't think they stayed at home because of me. Maybe they did, but I don't think so, because they've turned out before. I think they stayed at home because of D-Day, because of bets placed and so on. And, you know, people expect high standards in public life, and those things really let some people down. And, you know, there will be other factors. But I think staying at home was a sign that we just weren't offering them what they wanted. It is notable they didn't turn out and vote for Reform either. Yes,
well, and I mean, do you think actually, being a staunch Conservative Party supporter yourself, MPs like Steve losing his seat, I mean, did you predict that? Did you think this was going to happen?
Look, I mean, I was most upset of any MP to lose their seat. It was my friend Steve Baker. I was devastated to hear that he'd lost his seat, because I think he's probably one of the best Tory MPs that we had in Parliament, and I hope he stays in public life. I do think there were actually a lot of Conservative voters that stayed at home. Some went to go vote for Reform, some went to vote for Labour and the Liberal Democrats. We don't tend to talk about that so much. But Steve, I'd like to know from you, looking towards the future of the Conservative Party, who do you think the next leader should be? You famously backed Suella Braverman in the last leadership contest. Will you be backing her again?
Well, no, but it's not actually my responsibility now, thankfully, because I'm not an MP.
But presumably still a member.
Oh, of course I am, yes. Of course. No, I shall remain a member, of course I will. I do think that the Conservative Party is the best hope we have of good government, although this is a difficult moment to really reflect on that. But, well, we'll wait and see. I'll be like anyone else, like any other member. I will be voting on the last two. But why don't you put some combinations to me and see what I say?
Kemi Badenoch.
Or?
Robert Jenrick.
Kemi versus Robert, that's tricky. Oh, that's a cruel one. Probably Kemi.
Tom Tugendhat. Priti Patel.
Tom.
And
I think we've named all the remaining Tory MPs.
We have, but I just want to press on the Suella bit, because we did a poll online, and actually with GBNews viewers, Suella Braverman is the most popular potential future Tory leader. Do you think her record in government and her record as a member of Parliament and being a politician lends her to doing that role quite well or badly?
Well, it's a bit of a tricky question for me, because I was very close to Suella and we're friends. I don't want to be laying into her hard. But we parted ways over some of the language she used, which was too strident. As you know, I represent a very diverse community. And I think it's important when sensitive problems come up that we call out bad behaviour. But it's vital that we do it in a way which condemns individuals for their personal misconduct, say, rather than seeming to suggest that an entire community is guilty. We wouldn't accept that for the Jewish community. We wouldn't accept it for black people. We shouldn't accept it when it's done in relation to Muslims. So I'm afraid we parted company over the stridency of our language, and you know, I don't wish to get drawn too far down that. I think she just some of the language is just ill-advised and not appropriate for dealing with very sensitive
What
problems.
about her record as Home Secretary?
It's a bit unfortunate that we had such high immigration while Suella was Home Secretary. No doubt that was because some of her ideas were resisted by Number 10. But in the end, you know, if you're Home Secretary, part of the skill is getting your policy through collective agreement. But, you know, as I say, I'm not now a Member of Parliament. Actually, thank God. I'm glad it's over and behind me.
So you genuinely, you mean that?
Oh, I really do, Darren. It's great to be free of it.
Yeah? And what is it that you disliked about it?
Well, it's not that I disliked it. It's just it's a very grave burden to represent 75,000 people. You know, people are usually actively disinterested, and when they're not, they're very, very angry, typically, or they're in grave need. And it's just a major burden. And I'm happy. I would have been happy to continue, you know, carrying that duty forwards. I was looking forward to it, but my goodness, to be
Steve, can I ask? I forget which candidate, but one of the former Tory MPs said that it was so bad that half the MPs couldn't even be in the same tea room as their colleagues. Was it that fractious by the remaining years, the recent years? And also, you just sort of lent into it. What's it like on your mental health to be in a situation that pressured and that divided?
Well, I've talked about my mental health once before. I don't want to be a guy who talks a lot about his mental health, but I did talk about it with the Times, and that's well recorded. But that was really to do with the particular circumstances I faced. You know, I did what I did on Brexit, and I did what I did on COVID to, defend people's liberties. And, it's a hell of a thing to have a broadcast list of 130 MPs, and they're looking to you to tell them which way to vote in a rebellion that you've only just decided you're having because the government tabled something late or whatever. And that's actually a responsibility that Prime Ministers don't have, because they got support, they got time. So, that was a problem. But this issue of MPs not getting on with each other, I've not really exposed to. I've always made sure that I've personally cultivated relationships across the whole Conservative Party, possibly with one exception. But, so I try to get on. But it's vital to have positive relations.
Who was that?
Yeah.
Well, obviously Nadine.
Well, talking of Nadine, Steve, you, in Boris Johnson's final days, were a supporter of the then Prime Minister. You turned and said his time was up, and you were part of the rebellion to oust him. Do you regret that?
No, so I wasn't part of any rebellion to oust him. I did stand up and say time was up, because I really did think it was. I mean...
But do you regret that now, getting rid of Boris Johnson? Seeing the calamity that followed...
I did not remove Boris Johnson. I didn't campaign against him. I said I thought he should go, and I think that was right, and that was a reflection of my electors' views.
But do you not think going public and saying that the time's up, he needs to go, I mean, that is equal to saying, voting...
Well, I think I had a bigger effect on him and on the public debate than I expected I would have for a single intervention, and I suppose that's a compliment, but... he fell in the end because his handling of the Pincher affair was unacceptable to his own ministers, and I was not one of them. Those ministers resigned in a great avalanche out of his government. And whether people want him back for his charisma or not, you just can't be Prime Minister if your handling of crises doesn't meet with the confidence of your ministers.
So knowing what's happened over the past 48 hours, if you could go back to Boris's time again, would you still call for him to go? Knowing a Labour government would be coming...
I absolutely think that Boris, it was right that Boris went overall. But you can't keep somebody on just because they're charismatic. They've actually got to be good at governing.
Well, he's an election winner.
Yeah, but that's not enough. I'm sorry, this is a really important point. What kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country where the Prime Minister has the capacity to deliver like Rishi does, the ideology that can set up...
Steve, Rishi delivered? But, sorry to interject again, but Rishi didn't deliver. He just lost you a massive election.
So if you look at... Well, so it depends which issue you look at. So, for example, Northern Ireland, where I was operating, I didn't negotiate the Windsor Framework. I don't like the hard compromises in it. But it has to be said that Rishi Sunak delivered on that. He absolutely gripped all the detail, built a team around himself, and between us, I did the apology that reset the relationship. That set the ground so that he could then seize the detail and deliver. And he did do it, and he did it brilliantly. But what we need is both... Well, three things. The charisma of Boris Johnson, the ideology of Liz Truss, and the capacity to deal with detail that Rishi Sunak has.
Does Nigel Farage have that?
No. Nigel Farage, I'm afraid, I ought to be able to get on with him. But the problem with Nigel, and I remember going to a conference where I spoke after him, the problem with Nigel is it's the curse of easy answers. He was suggesting at that conference that basically everything would be easy if only the Conservatives would try. And it's such a seductive argument, but it's nonsense. All the problems we face are difficult. If they weren't difficult, we'd solve them. But we'd solve them because we like getting elected.
So what then do you think, forget the Conservative Party for a moment, what do you think is the future of conservatism in Britain? If you don't think it's the future is with Farage and reform, but also we've seen obviously the Conservative Party haven't had their best showing. So what is the future of conservatism?
Well, the future of conservatism really requires us to take stock of the situation we're in, decide what objectives we're trying to reach, and then work out a plan together. It's really very straightforward. The situation we're in is whatever problems we've got, they weren't caused by government being limited, by taxes being low, by budgets being balanced, or by debt being too low, or even by money being too tight with high interest rates, because we haven't had those things.
Who's the actor there? Is that a new party, or is that a coalition of
I'm sorry,
parties?
this is a really important point, right? So if the problem is that we've had big government, high spending, lots of debt, QE and cheap credit, that is not Conservative economic policy. And the problem is, I've said this in all the interviews I've done, for 50 years, the Western world's been living systematically beyond its means and using cheap credit and now QE to cover the gap. And you can't do that without manufacturing mass injustice. This is why people can't afford houses, young people particularly. If you pump lots of cheap credit into houses, don't be surprised if the price soars, particularly when planning law constrains the supply of land. And so these are disastrous policies, but in the end they arise because the state spends too much. So the future of conservatism actually is to face the real world as it is, which is that you can't spend more than you're earning in the long run. And your viewers know that, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, but I think there will be a lot of viewers, Steve, that actually quite liked the language of Suella Braverman, for example. They support her, they quite like this idea of a more robust conservatism. Just very briefly, what is it that you've got against that?
Oh, I haven't got anything against a robust conservatism. I don't think I've ever...
They might argue that the way in which you communicate that is very much in the language of Suella Braverman.
Well, I think they're wrong. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm now not looking to get elected by people, but accusing people of going on hate marches isn't the right thing to do, for example. So some of the people out there marching in relation to Gaza clearly are hate-filled, and clearly their behaviour should be condemned. But when I talk to some of the people in my constituency who are pillars of our community, just moral people, just people who believe in justice and morality, and absolutely motivated by compassion for children, innocent children, dying horribly, hospitals being bombed, people going without food, water and healthcare, those people do not deserve to be called hate marchers. And it causes outrage when they are. Now, we don't have to all agree with one another to treat one another with civility. Now, we made the point about disagreeing well, and that's the problem, because if we have a leader of this country who uses divisive language, as Nigel Farage has done in relation to Muslims, as I'm afraid Suella has done, that will only sow really dangerous divisions.